Hi, everybody. We're going to be talking about pragmatism this week, and we're specifically going to be focusing on John Dewey. And John Dewey is most associated with this progressive education movement in America. He played a central role in development in the United States. In Europe, we have Maria Montessori and Jean Piaget that were spreading the same type of message. And what they all agreed on was that children learn best from doing, and that education should involve real life material and experiences should encourage experimentation and independent thinking. These ideas are quite common right now, but for their time they were considered quite revolutionary and progressive. What's really interesting about John Dewey is his questions that he had about the profession seem to be timeless, and we seem to be discussing them over 150 years later from the birth of his inquiry. He asked questions like, how do we best introduce children to subject matter? How should we have multi-size classrooms? How can we best plan for curriculum? How can our supervisors or principals, vice principals, our superintendents, how can they help support classroom teachers? And most importantly, how should thinking skills be taught? And I'm hoping that throughout these slides, we'll address some of his questions. So let's talk a little bit about the biography of John Dewey. He was born in 1859 in Burlington, Vermont. His family were three-generation farmers in that area, and he found himself attending the University of Vermont, where he received a degree in philosophy. And in 1884, he ended up getting his PhD at Johns Hopkins University for philosophy as well. This doctorate degree led him to get a job at the University of Michigan. While serving as a professor of philosophy there, he became friends with one of his students. Her name was Alice Chipman, and after a few years, him and Alice ended up getting married in 1886, and she was largely the influence of John Dewey making a transition from just philosophy to educational philosophy. She was really interested in social problems and their relationship to education. Her interest was really contagious, and what ended up happening was John Dewey and herself ended up working together and to really understand what was the best way to support the education of children in America. In about 1894, they ended up moving to University of Chicago, where he took a teaching philosophy job. When Dewey got this position, he really found it to be desirable because what it did is it blended two things, the teaching of philosophy with both psychology and education theory. And what's really interesting is within 2 years, he created a laboratory school that attracted attention from all over the world. It was called Dewey's Laboratory School, and it was established obviously at the University of Chicago. And it was really considered to be the center of progressive education. This movement towards a more democratic and child-centered education. Progressive education was a reaction to this like rigid, formal style of traditional education during the 19th century. You know, if you think about that time, it was really the three R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And what he was proclaiming to do is to have education be more centered around the child and their interest and their capacity to grow in different ways. And although that lab was only open for 2 years, it really became this epicenter for progressive movement. In 1904, he basically had some argument with the administrators over the budget, and he ended up resigning from the position, and he took a new role at the Columbia University in New York City, and he stayed with that school for over 4 decades. In 1938, Dewey came out with a book called Experience in Education. And that book was basically talking about what is the teacher's role when it comes to education. And one of the things that he observed was a lot of teachers were lacking confidence in the planning of this experience. And he basically thought that teachers were too afraid that instruction, intentionally planned instruction, was going to infringe upon the freedom and the creativity of the students. And the thing that he responded was, through this book and through his research, was that children still need assistance from their teachers in making sense of the world. And so while you want learning to be individualized and personalized, it still needs to have structure that you can help students make sense of the world. And so in this book, Experience in Education, the question was asked, well, what should this assistance look like? And according to Dewey, the first thing that teachers should do is they should observe their children, and they should determine from these observations what kind of experiences the children are going to find interesting and relevant and that they're going to be ready for. He thought that education had a serious responsibility to invest in the planning and the organizing of these learning activities, so that activities needed to build off of past experiences and new skills gained from them. When it comes to this movement, it wasn't without criticism. And so one of the major criticisms to Dewey and this concept of this progressive education was that it allowed children too much freedom without appropriate guidance. And what's interesting is Dewey's response was he thought it was a legitimate criticism, and he thought that with this ongoing movement of progressive education, where it failed was when teachers didn't realize that the selection and the organization of the subject matter was so important. And he basically thought that children needed teachers to decide what is safe and also developmentally and individually appropriate for them and their age level. Dewey was also concerned about a lot of teachers claiming to be part of the progressive movement, and it was mainly because they were departing from that traditional rigid approach. And he recognized the danger from moving from one direction without clear understanding of this new direction. And so for him, he thought it was really important that having a good basis understanding of what this philosophical approach means will then lead to change behavior by the teachers. He also thought that, there was this misguided interpretation that somehow this progressive approach would be actually easier than the rigid, more traditional form. And I think there were some teachers that might have used this approach as a justification for basically improvising, not having a lot of structure for their students, and allowing students a little bit too much freedom when it comes to choosing their experiences. And the thing is, the teacher needs to be a guide, a conductor to this individual freedom, but it doesn't mean that it's not without structure. Dewey believed that the path for a quality education was really to get to know your students really well, to build on experiences from the past, for the teacher to be organized, and for the teacher to do a lot of planning. He basically thought this new method, the way you would do it, is through observation, documentation, and keeping records of past classes as a way to inform future instruction.